After last week's insane multiverse episode, My Adventures with Superman has now returned to basics in a season-long storyline-heavy episode that ends up being quite possibly the single best episode of the show so far, and that means a lot. This video will be my review for My Adventures with Superman Season 1, Episode 8, titled Zero Day Part 1. To start things off, I want to first focus on what is technically the less good part of the episode, but that's only because something had to be less good. It's a great episode in general, and that is Lois and Jimmy's role in the episode, which is wild that it's the worst part, because it's right here we get our first references to Batman through the introduction of Vicky Vale, who's Batman's maybe third most prominent love interest in the comics after Catwoman and Talia al Ghul, and who's confirmed to be working for the Gotham Gazette. Who knows, maybe this will lead to something in Season 2, maybe the exploration of Gotham, and hopefully the introduction of this universe's version of Batman. Vicky Vale was very different from what I expected. For one, her design differs rather drastically from the comics. She's like the fourth character on the show to be changed from ginger to something else. This time they didn't even change her race, just her hair color. It's beginning to be a bit weird, but she also looks more like a classic Lois Lane with glasses than anything, and she was definitely made intentionally unlikable as a Superman-hating foil to Jimmy and Lois. This works really well for Lois specifically, since she's been having to deal with the knowledge from the last episode that Superman sometimes becomes evil in alternate universes, which was an overall theme for the episode. People turning a bit on Superman, or maybe being a bit afraid of him, which I'll get back to in the Superman side of things, but I will say it worked really well for Lois's main role in the episode, maybe having a bit of doubt about whether or not Superman can or cannot become bad. Vicky's whole investigation also managed to involve a lot of the characters we've met from across the show, like the pilot, Flip Johnson, and Alex, who based on his dialogue is even more likely now to be Lex Luthor. This part of the episode felt like maybe a very intentional parallel to all the villains returning, while also just being a very nice way of making this metropolis feel very populated and lived in this episode. The Jimmy side of things was definitely what I would call the most ridiculous part of the episode. His YouTube channel is becoming a bit absurd because of the numbers being thrown around. It's also inconsistent between what's seen on screen and what's being said. None of this is because I'm jealous or anything, no, definitely not, it's just crazy. Although, I will say, it was through the YouTube stuff that we got references to two Superman characters, Bebo Babowski and Lori Lamaris, which were fun references. Still though, this side of the episode was nice and fit extremely well with the Superman stuff, but this Batman character appearance filled with returning characters and references is heavily overshadowed by the main plot of the episode. And now that we've gotten that out of the way, let's get to the good stuff, and there is genuinely a good amount of things to talk about with the main plot. The Superman related story of this episode is fantastic. What the trailer of the episode focused on was Clark gaining his super hearing, in my opinion one of his quintessential powers, which is used brilliantly in this episode in many different ways as well. The episode takes a very realistic look at a Superman who just gained super hearing as someone who can hear any and all issues people have, and then has the power to go help, but in doing so is unable to sleep and then might be going crazy as he completely burns himself out. I love this approach as well. It starts out really funny, it becomes something completely different over the course of the episode, and I think it worked brilliantly throughout. For one, it quickly becomes about Clark maybe becoming a bit obsessed with finding the General, who is still currently unnamed, which is where I felt like the General was cemented as the main villain of the season, adding greatly to the main hero-main villain rivalry, and then the tension of the climax of this episode. Still though, despite the focus on his obsession, the episode has this really great classic Superman moment of reuniting a lost kid with her parents, and I absolutely love that moment. It was just pure Superman energy. However, the super hearing then becomes a part of the overlying theme of the episode of people maybe being afraid of Superman as he's completely burning himself out and even losing control of his powers, although Clark chasing down the mist was arguably the least memorable part of the episode, if anything. Still, this all leads to this fantastically written scene between the main trio of Jimmy and Lois telling Clark that he's burned out, which follows up on Clark's growing obsession and his own insecurities of maybe not being normal, which is brought up by Lois. This was an incredible scene that gets to the very core of Superman and what aspects of the character the show is focused on, or even added. It's such a fantastically written and fantastically pulled off scene and emotional climax to the episode, and yet it's probably not even the best part of the episode either. This is just a great episode with so many things going for it. In the very first scene of the episode, the show brings back basically every single villain from the show so far, aside from Mr. Mixie Spitalik and The Mist, but The Mist comes back back a bit later, including Silver Banshee, Roughhouse, Parasite, Slade, Livewire, and Heatwave, who together as Task Force X feel like this show's Superman version of the Sinister Six. They do also just so happen to be 6 villains who made for such fun action and intense conflict, as there did come a point in this episode where it felt like Superman, or at the very least this early days version of Superman, didn't stand a chance. It made for a really brutal final showdown that felt like something I've never really seen before done with Superman, aided by some fantastic, fluid, and impressive animation during said fight scene. Task Force X didn't really have much in the way of interesting interactions with each other. I don't think all of them even had dialogue. The ones that did have some good interactions with Superman, but even still, just the 6 characters fighting together with their unique but also mildly uniform designs, and also contrasting powers and abilities, again aided by some fantastic animation, was so fun to watch. Genuinely a great execution of a Superman Sinister Six, done in a way that really could have only been done on this show in particular, also because I never would have put Anthony Ivo, Deathstroke, Heatwave, or even Roughhouse on a Superman Sinister Six, but I would be lying if I said this bothered me, aside from maybe Slade, who could have easily been Bloodsport. This show has taken its own approach on things, and taking out my preconceived knowledge of Superman, Task Force X, its members, and this big showdown were very well built up and very well paid off. Also because this is this universe's first version of the Suicide Squad, and it would be weird if the Suicide Squad was just Superman villains. Here you do also have Heatwave, who's a Flash villain, Deathstroke, who's a Teen Titans villain, Anthony Ivo, who's a Justice League villain, and everything else is Superman, but you get the idea. So like I said, while watching this episode, I genuinely thought Superman would just lose because him being taken by the General felt like a natural continuation to the episode, all of which is already a bit of a subversion of a typical Superman story, as Superman doesn't really typically lose many fights, and when he does, like against Doomsday, which was also a tie, he dies. So that was already a subversion of expectations, but then the show subverted its own expectations by having the Superman Blue anime power-up moment, allowing for Superman to mollywop Task Force X, and then subverted expectations again by having Parasite come back to completely overpower Superman and bring us right back to the initial expectation of Superman being taken in by the government. And while all of that is happening, the intensity of the conflict here absolutely never ceased, even after Superman was defeated and taken, as the episode I think had the brilliant idea of refocusing on Lois and Jimmy, as I'm sure the writers knew that the viewers would put together rather quickly in fact, that the General is probably General Sam Lane, Lois's frequently mentioned, seemingly estranged father. This made these final few moments maybe the most intense of the episode, as Lois is itching closer and closer to Superman, to which if she arrived in time, she would probably have a significant effect on the way things go down, because it's her father, her estranged father, who's in charge of things. In the end, Lois misses everything by mere moments, but that doesn't change how intense the episode in the end was, and it also just adds to the anticipation of the inevitable on-screen meeting, either in the next episode or in the finale, between Lois and her father, that the show has now successfully made me excited for against all odds. And also, of course, this confrontation between Superman and the General in this episode was really great. This main hero, main villain rivalry has really been built up well. I also really like the detail that the General repeats the exact same line that Alex said of Superman being the end of the world, either suggesting that Alex works for the General in some way and is aware of Zero Day, because why would he say that Superman is the end of the world in particular, or maybe Vicky Vale put that quote into her article, which the General read and repeated. Either way, it was a nice detail that hints at something. In the end, after 2 episodes that I didn't really like as much, this episode thankfully returns to the overarching storyline in such a way that made for what is probably one of the most exciting, well-written, visually appealing, well-animated, and story-centric episodes of the series, that introduces Superman's super hearing in a really fun and interesting way, takes a really interesting approach on a burnt-out and obsessed Superman, builds up the main hero, main villain rivalry really well, and leads to a fantastic climactic ending to an otherwise already really good episode with some really high emotional moments, and somehow through all of this, it's the Batman character appearance and Gotham City references that is the least memorable part of the episode. All of that is to say that this is now my single favorite episode of the series so far, and so I'm giving this season its second 9 out of 10 rating. There's nothing really in particular I disliked enough about this episode that is preventing it from a 10 out of 10. I just don't think it quite deserves it, but it's certainly closer than episode 5, which is the previous 9 out of 10 episode. Either way, the season is looking to end on an extreme high note as the trailer for the next episode looks really interesting, so let's hope that it is.